My name is Eli Thornton. I was born in 1848, spring of that year, on a farm in Franklin County, Pennsylvania. That makes me. Well, I turned 89 last April. I'm telling this now because there aren't many of us left who remember the war from the home side, from being the ones who stayed behind and waited. Everybody wants to hear from the soldiers, and that's right, that's proper. But somebody should tell about the families too, about the folks who watched them go. I need you to understand what the farm was like before everything changed. Our place sat about 3 miles outside Chambersburg, 140 acres, give or take, mostly wheat and corn, some pasture for dairy cows. My father, Josiah Thornton, he'd bought that land in 1843 with money saved from working ironworks down in Maryland. He'd served in the Mexican War, came back with a bad limp and no taste for adventure anymore. Just wanted to work his land, raise his family quiet. My mother, Prudence, she came from Quaker stock, though she'd married outside the faith. She kept a garden that could feed us through winter, and then some. There were 4 of us children. Marcus was the oldest, born in 1841. Then me, 7 years younger. Our sister Beatrice came in 1852, and there was another baby between us who didn't make it past his first winter, but I don't remember him much. Marcus, though. Marcus I remember clear as anything. He was tall, taller than father by the time he turned 18. Had mother's dark hair and father's gray eyes. Worked like a mule from sunup to sundown and never complained about it. Saturdays, if the work was caught up, he'd take me down to Conococheague Creek to fish. That creek ran cold, even in August, spring-fed, and you could catch trout in there if you were patient. Marcus taught me to tie flies using thread and feathers from mother's chickens. I can still see his hands working that thread, big rough hands that somehow managed those tiny delicate knots. He'd say, "Eli, you got to think like the fish. What would you want to eat if you were swimming around down there?" I was 12 years old in the spring of 1861. 12 years old, and I thought I knew everything about the world, thought our farm was the whole universe. I'd wake up before dawn to the sound of father already moving around downstairs, the smell of coffee and wood smoke drifting up through the floorboards. By the time I got down to the kitchen, Marcus would already be out doing first milking. I'd eat whatever mother had ready, usually cornmeal mush with molasses, and then head out to help with whatever needed doing. The work changed with the seasons, but it was always there. Spring meant plowing and planting. Summer meant weeding and haying. Fall meant harvest. Winter meant repair and preparation for spring again. It was hard work, don't misunderstand me, but it was good work. Honest work. You could see what you'd done at the end of the day. Things started changing in the winter of 1860, though I didn't understand it at the time. Father would come back from town with newspapers from Harrisburg, sometimes from Philadelphia, and he'd sit at the kitchen table reading them with his jaw set tight. Mother would ask what the news was, and he'd just shake his head, fold the paper up, say, "Nothing good, Prudence. Nothing good at all." Marcus would lean over his shoulder, trying to read the headlines. I remember one evening, must have been late November or early December, Marcus asked father straight out, "Do you think there'll be war?" And father looked at him for a long time before answering. "I think men are fools," he said finally. And fools always find reasons to fight. But it wasn't abstract for long. After Lincoln got elected, things moved fast. South Carolina seceded in December, then more states followed, and by spring of 1861, everybody knew war was coming, whether they wanted it or not. When Fort Sumter fell in April, that settled it. The president called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. 75,000 men. I remember father saying, "That's an army bigger than anything we had in Mexico. This is going to be bad." Marcus was 20 years old that spring. He'd been courting Catherine Welch for about 2 years by then. She was the daughter of a shopkeeper in Chambersburg. Pretty girl with blonde hair she wore in braids coiled around her head. She'd come out to the farm on Sundays after church, and Mother would make a nice dinner, and we'd all sit together. Catherine had a good laugh, the kind that made other people want to laugh too. Marcus was planning to ask her father for permission to marry, was saving money to build a small house on the corner of our property where the old tobacco barn had fallen down. They had it all figured out, or thought they did. The first recruitment meeting happened in Chambersburg in mid-April. Captain Thaddeus Burke came up from Harrisburg to sign up volunteers for what would become the Pennsylvania regiments. Owen Ridgway, who was Marcus's best friend since they were boys, he went to that meeting and came back all fired up about duty and honor and preserving the Union. Owen's father had died when he was young, so he didn't have anybody to tell him not to go. He started working on Marcus right away, saying they should enlist together, saying it would be over by Christmas, saying this was their chance to be part of something bigger than Franklin County. I remember the night Marcus told us he was going to enlist. It was late April. We'd just finished supper, and he stood up from the table instead of sitting back with coffee like usual. He said, "I need to tell you all something," and Mother's face went white before he even got the words out. She knew. Mothers always know. He said he'd been thinking about it, praying about it, and he felt it was his duty to go. Said the Union needed men, said Pennsylvania was going to raise regiments, and he wanted to be part of it. Syed Owen was going, and they'd look out for each other. Father didn't say anything at first. He just sat there looking at his coffee cup, churning it in his hands. Finally he said, "You know what war is, boy?" Marcus said, "You told me about Mexico, Father." And Father said, "I told you so. I didn't tell you what it's really like. I didn't tell you about the dysentery that kills more men than bullets, about watching your friends die slow from infected wounds because there's no proper doctors, about lying in mud so thick you can't tell if you're sleeping on ground or on bodies." His voice was quiet, but there was something in it I'd never heard before, something that scared me. Marcus stood there taking it, and then he said, "I understand that, sir, but I still feel I have to go." Mother started crying then, not loud, just tears running down her face while she cleared the dishes. Beatrice was too young to understand. She was only 9, but she knew something bad was happening. I felt like my chest was being squeezed in a vice. Marcus was my hero, you understand. Everything I knew about being a man I learned from watching him. The idea of him leaving, of the farm without him, I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Catherine came by the next day. I was supposed to be doing chores, but I stayed close to the house, close enough to hear them talking in the parlor. She was begging him not to go, saying they could get married right away, saying she'd wait, but please don't volunteer. Wait and see if they really need more men. Marcus's voice was lower, harder to hear, but I caught pieces. "It's because I love you that I have to go, and I can't stay home when other men are fighting, and my father served. How can I not?" She left crying. I watched from the barn loft as she walked down the lane to the road, her shoulders shaking. The next 2 weeks are kind of a blur in my memory. Marcus went into Chambersburg and signed his name to the enlistment papers. He was assigned to the 126th Pennsylvania Infantry Regiment, Company D. They were supposed to muster in Harrisburg by mid-May. Mother went quiet, moved through the house like a ghost, cooking and cleaning, but not really there. Father threw himself into the farm work, pushing all of us harder than necessary. I think he needed to stay busy, or he'd have broken down. Marcus tried to make everything normal, tried to joke around with me like always, but it was forced. One evening, he took me down to the creek one last time. We sat on the bank with our fishing poles, but neither of us was really paying attention to the lines. He said, "Eli, I need you to be the man of the house while I'm gone. Help Father with everything. Take care of Mother and Beatrice. I said, You'll be back by Christmas though, right? That's what Owen said. He looked at me, and I could see he didn't believe it, but he said, maybe, maybe. So, then he put his hand on my shoulder and said, You're a good brother. Don't forget that. The uniform came a few days before he had to leave. It arrived in a package from Harrisburg, Union blue wool with brass buttons. Mother made him try it on in the kitchen, and it was too big in some places, too tight in others, but he looked different in it. Older, not like my brother anymore, like a soldier from a newspaper illustration. The wool smelled like chemicals and dye, sharp and new. Marcus stood there in front of the mirror we kept by the back door, adjusting the jacket, and I saw him swallow hard. Father said, It'll do, and walked out to the barn. His last night home, Mother made all his favorite dishes. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes with butter and cream, green beans from the cellar, apple pie with cheese. We sat around that table and tried to pretend it was just another Sunday dinner, but nobody could keep up the pretense. Catherine was there too, sitting close to Marcus, holding his hand under the table where she thought we couldn't see. After dinner, Father brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving and poured a small glass for Marcus. Said, You're a man now. Act like one. Marcus drank it in one swallow and didn't cough even though I could tell it burned. That was the only time I ever saw my father give any of us children liquor. The morning of May 15th, 1861, we loaded into the wagon before dawn. Father drove. Marcus sat next to him in his uniform. Mother and Beatrice and I sat in the back. The ride to Chambersburg took about 40 minutes on the road. It was a cool morning. I remember that, fog still hanging in the low places. Mother had packed Marcus a bundle of food for the train ride, and she kept checking it, rearranging it, like if she kept her hands busy, she wouldn't have to think about what was happening. Other families were coming into town too, wagons and buggies all heading to the train station. Young men in new blue uniforms, some of them looking excited, some looking scared, some looking like they hadn't slept in days. Owen Ridgway was there already, laughing too loud, slapping people on the back. When he saw Marcus, he came over and said, There he is. We're going to show those rebels what Pennsylvania boys are made of. Marcus smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Captain Burke was there, taking names, checking his roster, shouting orders that nobody was quite obeying yet. The train was late. We stood there on the platform for over an hour, waiting. Mother couldn't stop touching Marcus, straightening his collar, adjusting his cap, like she was memorizing him through her hands. When the train finally came, the whistle so loud it hurt your ears. Everything happened too fast. Captain Burke started yelling for the men to form up, to get their gear, to board the cars. Marcus hugged Mother, and she wouldn't let go until Father gently pulled her back. He shook Father's hand. Father said something I couldn't hear. He picked up Beatrice and spun her around once, kissed her forehead. Then he turned to me. I was trying so hard not to cry, trying to be tough like I thought a man should be. He put his hand on top of my head, messed up my hair the way he always did, and said, Take care of them. Eli, I'm counting on you. Then he picked up his haversack and got on the train. I can still see him standing at the window of that train car. He found us in the crowd and raised his hand, waving. Mother was crying openly now, calling his name. Father had his arm around her shoulders, his face like stone. Beatrice was waving both hands, shouting, Bye, Marcus, bye. The train lurched, started moving, picked up speed. Marcus's face got smaller and smaller, and then the train went around a bend, and he was gone, just like that. 7 years of following him around the farm, learning everything from him, and then he was gone, and the platform was full of crying women and silent men, and the smell of coal smoke hanging in the air. We rode home in silence. When we got back to the farm, Mother went straight to Marcus's room and closed the door. Father and I did the evening chores without talking. At supper, there were only 4 plates on the table instead of 5, and that empty space was louder than any words. That night, lying in bed, I could hear Mother crying through the walls. It was the saddest sound I'd ever heard. I kept thinking Marcus would be back by Christmas. That's what everybody said. By Christmas this would all be over, and things would go back to normal. I believed that for a long time. Too long. The waiting was worse than anything I could have imagined. People talk about war like it's all battles and glory, but for the ones left behind, it's mostly just waiting. Waiting for letters, waiting for news, waiting for the sound of Homer Jessup's wagon coming down the lane because Homer was our mail carrier, and he'd make special trips if there was a letter from a soldier. You'd hear those wheels, and your heart would jump into your throat, and you'd run to meet him, hoping, always hoping. Marcus's first letter came about 3 weeks after he left. I remember Mother saw Homer coming, and she practically flew out of the house, didn't even take off her apron. Homer handed her the envelope, and she just stood there looking at it, holding it with both hands like it might disappear. She didn't open it until we were all together that evening after supper. Her hands were shaking, so Bad Father had to help her slit it open with his pocket knife. The letter was dated May 28th, written from a camp outside Harrisburg. Marcus wrote about the training, about learning to march in formation, about the food which he said wasn't as good as Mother's, but was decent enough. He wrote about Owen, said they'd been assigned to the same company like they'd hoped. He said the officers were working them hard, but he felt ready, felt prepared for whatever came. The letter ended saying he loved us all, and thought about the farm every day, and missed Catherine something terrible. Mother read it out loud 3 times that night, and then folded it carefully, and put it in her apron pocket, where she kept it for weeks. The letters came regularly at first, maybe one every 10 days or 2 weeks. The regiment moved from Harrisburg to Washington City, and Marcus wrote about seeing the Capitol building, about how big the city was, how many soldiers were gathering there from all over the North. He wrote about the heat, about drilling in dust that got into everything, about rumors that they'd be moving into Virginia soon to engage the rebel forces. His handwriting was neat at first, careful, like he was being formal for us. Mother would read each letter to the whole family, and then Catherine would come by on Sunday, and Mother would let her read them privately in the parlor. Catherine started looking thinner, I noticed, more tired. She'd sit in church, staring at nothing, while the Reverend preached, and I don't think she heard a word of it. By late summer, the tone of the letters started changing. Marcus wrote less about the excitement and more about the boredom, the long marches in the heat, the poor water that gave half the regiment the runs. He mentioned names of boys from the company, boys we didn't know, and sometimes in the next letter, those same names would be listed as sick or dead from typhoid or dysentery. It started to sink in that men were dying without ever seeing battle, just dying from disease in camp. Father would read these letters with his jaw getting tighter and tighter. He knew. He'd seen it in Mexico. He'd tried to warn Marcus, but you can't really warn somebody about something like that. You have to live it to understand it. Then came September of 1862. That's when everything changed. The newspapers started reporting a big battle in Maryland, down near a town called Sharpsburg, near a creek called Antietam. The 126th Pennsylvania was there. That much we knew from the reports. The newspaper said it was the bloodiest single day in American history. 23,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in one day. 23,000. I couldn't even picture that many people, let alone that many casualties. Father read the report out loud at breakfast, and Mother made a sound like she'd been hit in the stomach. We didn't have a letter from Marcus yet. Didn't know if he'd been in the fighting or not. We'd gotten one letter from him dated September 10th, about a week before the battle. He wrote that they could hear artillery fire in the distance, that everyone knew something big was coming. He said he was scared, but ready. Said he trusted his officers and his fellow soldiers. He ended that letter differently than the others. He wrote, "If something happens to me, I want you to know that I love you all more than words can say, that I'm proud to be a Thornton, that I died for something I believed in." Mother couldn't finish reading it out loud. Father had to take over, and his voice was rough, catching on the words. Then silence. 1 week passed, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, no letter. Homer Jessup would come down the lane and Mother would meet him, and Homer would shake his head, say, "Sorry, Prudence. Nothing today." He'd look at the ground when he said it. Couldn't meet her eyes. Other families in the county were getting news, good and bad. The Simmons boy came home with his arm gone. The Fletcher's oldest son was reported killed at Antietam. The Henshaw family got word their boy was in a hospital in Washington with a fever, but we heard nothing. The not knowing was like a physical pain. You'd wake up in the morning, and for just a second you'd forget, and then you'd remember, and the weight would settle back on your chest. Father kept working the farm, but his mind wasn't in it. He'd stand in the middle of a field holding a tool, just staring at nothing. Mother stopped sleeping. I'd get up in the night to use the privy, and I'd see lamplight under her door, hear her moving around at 2 or 3 in the morning. Beatrice was too young to fully understand, but she knew something was wrong. She'd ask, "When is Marcus coming home?" And nobody knew how to answer her. Catherine stopped coming by. I think it was too painful for her to be at the farm without him. We heard later she'd taken to her bed, wouldn't eat, that her mother was worried she was making herself sick. Our neighbor Silas Hoffman came by in early October. Silas had lost his own boy at Bull Run the year before, knew what waiting felt like. He sat with Father on the porch, and they didn't talk much, just sat there smoking pipes. Before he left, Silas put his hand on Father's shoulder and said, "No news might be good news, Josiah. Hold on to that." But Father just nodded, didn't say anything back. I took over more of Marcus's chores. I was only 13, but I was strong for my age, and I needed to stay busy or I'd go crazy with worry. I'd be out in the barn or in the fields, and I'd catch myself looking down the lane, expecting to see Marcus walking home, grinning, saying it was all a mistake, saying he was fine. Sometimes I'd dream he was there, and I'd wake up, and the disappointment was so sharp it felt like dying. I started going down to the creek by myself, sitting where we used to fish together. I'd talk to him in my head, telling him about what was happening on the farm, asking him to send word, begging him to be alive. I wasn't much for praying, but I prayed then. Every night before I slept, I'd pray that Marcus was safe, that he'd come home, that this nightmare would end. The newspapers kept coming, and we'd read them desperate for any scrap of information about the 126th Pennsylvania. We learned they'd fought at a place called Sunken Road, that it had been savage fighting at close range, that the regiment had taken heavy casualties. But there were no detailed lists of who was killed or wounded or missing. The Army didn't work that way. Information came slow, filtered through layers of bureaucracy, if it came at all. We heard about other Pennsylvania regiments, other companies, but nothing specific about Company D November came and went. December arrived, and the farm was hard and frozen, and so were we. Mother hung Marcus's stocking at Christmas out of habit or hope, or maybe just because she couldn't bear not to. We didn't celebrate much that year. Catherine's father came by on Christmas Eve with a basket of food from their store, said Catherine sent her love, but couldn't come herself. He looked older than I remembered, worn down. The whole county felt that way. So many boys gone, so many families waiting. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was still going strong with no end in sight. I turned 14 that winter. Birthdays didn't mean much anymore. Spring came around again, 1863 now, and we'd been without word from Marcus for over 6 months. 6 months of silence. Father had stopped reading the newspapers, said he couldn't bear it anymore. Mother had put all of Marcus's letters in a wooden box that she kept on her dresser. Sometimes I'd see her sitting on her bed with the box open, holding the letters, not reading them, just holding them. Her hair had gone gray, seemed like it happened almost overnight. She was only 42 years old, but she looked 60. Then one day in early April, a man came walking up our lane on foot. It was a Tuesday. I remember because I was supposed to be harrowing the south field, but I'd stopped to adjust the harness when I saw him. He was wearing a Union uniform, officer's insignia, but he walked with a heavy limp, and his uniform hung loose on him like he'd lost weight. He carried a cane. I didn't recognize him at first, but as he got closer, I realized it was Wesley Carmichael, a lieutenant who'd enlisted from Chambersburg, same time as Marcus. I'd seen him at the station that morning they all left. My stomach dropped. Officers didn't make social calls. When an officer showed up at your door, it meant news, and news after 6 months of silence was never good. I dropped the reins and ran toward the house, ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, because I needed to get there before he did, needed to warn Mother somehow, though I don't know what I thought I could do. Lieutenant Carmichael saw me running, and he stopped walking, just stood there in the lane waiting for me to reach him. When I got close enough to see his face properly, I could tell he'd been through hell. His left eye had a scar running through the eyebrow, and his cheek was sunken on that side. He looked at me and said, "You're Eli, aren't you?" Marcus's little brother. I couldn't speak, just nodded. He said, "Is your mother home? Your father?" I managed to say, "Yes, sir," and my voice came out like a croak. He nodded and said, "I need to speak with them. I'm sorry. I should have come sooner, but I've been in the hospital in Washington until last month." We walked to the house together, him limping along with that cane, me feeling like I was moving through deep water, like everything had slowed down and gotten heavy. Mother must have seen us from the window, because the door opened before we reached it, and she stood there in the doorway, her hand over her mouth. She knew. Just like she'd known when Marcus first said he was enlisting, she knew now what Lieutenant Carmichael had come to tell us. Father came out from the barn, saw the officer, and his whole body seemed to sag. He climbed the porch steps slowly and stood next to Mother. Lieutenant Carmichael took off his cap and held it in both hands. He said, "Mr. and Mrs. Thornton, I'm Wesley Carmichael. I served with your son Marcus in Company D. May I come in?" We sat in the parlor, the 5 of us, Beatrice too, because Mother wouldn't let her leave. Mother held Beatrice on her lap, even though Beatrice was 10 years old and getting too big for that. Lieutenant Carmichael sat in the chair by the window, the good chair we kept for guests, and he looked out at the farm for a moment before he started talking. He said, "I want you to know that Marcus was one of the finest men I ever served with. He was brave, he was steady, he looked after the younger boys in the company, and they looked up to him." He paused and rubbed his face with one hand. "I was there at Antietam. I was there when we went into the sunken road." Mother made a sound, a little gasp, and Father reached over and took her hand. Lieutenant Carmichael told us what happened. He said the 126th Pennsylvania had been ordered to advance across open ground toward a sunken farm road where Confederate forces were dug in. He said it was mid-morning on September 17th, 1862. He said they went forward at quick time, and the rebels opened up on them when they were about 100 yards out. He said men started falling immediately, just dropping like someone had cut strings holding them up. He said Marcus was in the front rank, next to Owen Ridgway, and they kept going even when men around them were falling. He said when they got close to the road, maybe 30 or 40 yards out, the fire got heavier. He said that's when Marcus was hit. I was watching Mother's face while he talked. She'd gone completely white, like all the blood had drained out of her. Father's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscles jumping. Lieutenant Carmichael said, "It was quick. He was hit in the chest, and he went down, and I don't think he suffered long." His voice caught, and he stopped for a moment. Owen and we pulled him back behind a small rise, got him out of the direct fire. We tried to stop the bleeding, but there was too much of it. He was conscious for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. He said, "Tell my family I love them." He tried to get his pocket watch out. His father's watch said to send it home, but there wasn't time. He closed his eyes, and that was it. He was gone. The silence after he stopped talking was absolute. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, could hear a crow calling outside, could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Mother was crying without making any sound, tears just streaming down her face. Beatrice started crying too, probably because Mother was crying, because she could feel the grief, even if she didn't fully understand it. Father sat like a stone statue, his hand still holding Mother's hand, staring at nothing. I felt numb, like my whole body had been packed in ice. Marcus was dead, had been dead for over 6 months, had been lying in the ground in Maryland while we waited and hoped and prayed. All that time we'd been waiting, he'd already been gone. Lieutenant Carmichael reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He said, "This is the official record, what little there is. He's listed as killed in action at Antietam, buried in a field grave near Sharpsburg with other men from the company. I'm sorry, Mrs. Thornton, Mr. Thornton, but I have to tell you that the burial was hasty. We had so many dead that day, thousands of them, and we couldn't give each man a proper grave. They were buried together in trenches, marked with wooden stakes that probably aren't there anymore. I don't know if you'll be able to find his grave specifically. I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you different." Mother let out a wail then, a sound I'd never heard from her before, a sound like an animal in mortal pain. She bent forward, still holding Beatrice, and sobbed. Father stood up abruptly and walked out of the room, walked out of the house. I heard the door slam. Through the window I saw him walk to the barn and disappear inside. Lieutenant Carmichael sat there looking miserable, twisting his cap in his hands. He said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I've had to do this 6 times now. Visit families, tell them their boys aren't coming home. It doesn't get easier." He stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "If there's anything I can do, anything at all, please let me know. Marcus deserved better than this. He deserved to come home." After he left, I sat with Mother in the parlor while she cried. Beatrice had run upstairs to her room. The house felt different, felt empty in a way it hadn't before. Before there'd been hope, even desperate hope, even the thinnest thread of possibility that Marcus might still be alive somewhere. Now even that was gone. He was dead, had been dead since September 17th, 1862, at a place called Sunken Road near Sharpsburg, Maryland. He was 21 years old. He never got to marry Catherine. He never got to build that house on the corner of our property. He never got to see how the war turned out, never knew if the Union would survive. He just died in the dirt on a farm in Maryland and got buried in a mass grave with men whose names nobody recorded. Father didn't come back to the house until after dark. When he did come in, he went straight to Marcus's room and closed the door. I heard him in there moving things around. The next morning, Marcus's room looked the same as it always had. Bed made, clothes in the wardrobe, fishing tackle in the corner, but somehow it felt different. It felt like a shrine now, like a museum of a person who'd existed but didn't anymore. Mother kept it exactly that way for the rest of her life. She'd go in there once a week to dust and sweep, but nothing was ever moved, nothing was ever changed. Reverend Amos Pritchard came by a few days later to offer condolences and to ask if we wanted a memorial service. Mother said yes. So on a Sunday in late April of 1863, we held a funeral for Marcus at our little church in Chambersburg. There was no body, of course, just an empty space where a coffin should have been. Reverend Pritchard gave a sermon about sacrifice and duty and the kingdom of heaven, but I don't remember much of it. I was looking at Catherine Welch, who sat with her parents in the pew across from us. She looked like she'd aged 10 years in the last months. Her face was drawn, her eyes hollow. She cried through the whole service, quiet tears that wouldn't stop. After it was over, she came up to Mother, and they held each other and cried together, and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. I saw Catherine a few more times over the next year, always at church, always sitting with her parents. She never married Marcus, obviously. Couldn't marry a dead man, and I think part of her died with him that day at Antietam, even though she was hundreds of miles away. She married a man named Thomas Garrett in 1865, right after the war ended. He was older, a widower with 2 children who needed a mother. I don't think she loved him. I think she just needed to move forward, needed to have a life, even if it wasn't the life she'd planned. She never came back to our farm after the memorial service. It would have hurt too much. Owen Ridgway survived the war. He came home in '65, looking 20 years older than he should have, missing 2 fingers on his left hand from a wound at Gettysburg. He came by the farm once, maybe a month after he got back. He and Father sat on the porch and talked for a long time. I don't know what they said to each other, but when Owen left, Father came in and went to his room, and I heard him crying. It was the only time I ever heard my father cry. Owen moved west after that, out to Ohio or maybe Indiana. I heard he died in the '80s, never married, lived alone. I think the war took something from him he could never get back, same as it took Marcus from us. The farm felt wrong after that. The work was still there. The seasons still changed. Life went on because it had to, but there was a hole in everything. Every time I did a chore that used to be Marcus's job, I felt it. Every time I walked past his room, I felt it. Every time we sat down to dinner, and there were only 4 of us at the table, I felt it. Father got quieter over the years, more withdrawn. Mother's hair went completely white by the time she was 50. Beatrice grew up in a house full of grief, never really knowing the brother she'd lost, just knowing the absence of him. I turned 15, 16, 17, and when I got old enough to enlist, Father told me flat out, no, I lost 1 son to that damned war. I won't lose another. I didn't argue with him. By then it was 1864, and the war was grinding on, getting bloodier and more terrible, and I didn't want to go anyway. I was too angry, too full of bitterness about what it had cost us, what it had cost for nothing, because Marcus died at Antietam, and the war went on for nearly 3 more years after that, hundreds of thousands more dead, and I couldn't see what any of it had been for. I'm 89 years old now as I tell you this. 89 years old, and Marcus has been gone for 75 of those years. That's a strange thing to think about. I've lived almost my entire life without my brother, and yet he's still so present in my memory, still so real to me, that sometimes I forget he's been dead longer than he was ever alive. He got 21 years on this earth. 21 years. I've had 89 and counting. There's no fairness in it, no logic to it. It just is. After the war ended in 1865, the country tried to move on, tried to rebuild, tried to make sense of what we'd done to ourselves. 620,000 men dead, they say. though nobody really knows the exact number. Could be more, could be less. Marcus was just one name in that vast ocean of loss. One more Pennsylvania farm boy who went off to preserve the Union and never came home. The history books don't mention him. There's no monument with his name on it, at least not that I've ever found. He's just gone, erased, like he never existed except in the memories of the people who loved him. And we're all dying now, all of us who remember, and soon there won't be anyone left who knew him at all. Father died in 1879. He was 64 years old, wore out from hard work and harder grief. On his deathbed he talked about Marcus. Thought I was Marcus for a little while there at the end. He said, "You came home, boy. I knew you would. I knew you'd come home." I didn't correct him. Let him die thinking his son had made it back. Mother lasted until 1891. She was 72. She never got over losing Marcus, never stopped grieving him. When we cleaned out her room after she passed, we found that wooden box with all his letters, every single one he'd ever sent home, kept safe all those years. We buried it with her. Seemed right somehow. Beatrice married a banker from Harrisburg and moved away in 1872. She had 4 children, lived a good life as far as I know. We drifted apart over the years the way families sometimes do. She died in 1928. I went to her funeral and realized I was the last one left of the original Thornton family, the last one who remembered the farm before the war, the last one who remembered Marcus as a living, breathing person instead of just a name and a story. I never enlisted, like I said. Father wouldn't allow it, and by the time he died in 79, I was 31 years old, and the war had been over for 14 years. I stayed on the farm, worked it with Father until he passed, then ran it myself. I married late, at 36, to a woman named Margaret, who was a teacher in Chambersburg. We had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Named my oldest son Marcus. Margaret said I should, said it would honor my brother's memory. Little Marcus grew up hearing stories about his uncle, about the man he was named for who he'd never meet. I tried to keep the memory alive, but I don't know how much of it was real memory and how much was what I wanted to remember, what I needed my brother to have been. In 1892, there was a big ceremony at Antietam for the 30th anniversary of the battle. They were dedicating monuments, making the battlefield into a national park. I went. Margaret didn't want me to, said it would just open old wounds, but I needed to see it, needed to stand where Marcus had died. It was late September, almost exactly 30 years to the day. The weather was similar to how they described it in the accounts, cool and clear. There were hundreds of veterans there, old men now, wearing their uniforms that didn't fit anymore, wearing their medals and their memories. There were speeches and prayers and a band playing. But what I remember most is walking out to the sunken road. It's called Bloody Lane now. That's what everyone calls it. It's just a farm road, a dirt track worn down between 2 fields. Nothing special about it, except that on September 17th, 1862, thousands of men died there in a few hours of savage fighting. I stood there looking at it, and I tried to picture Marcus in that chaos, tried to see him falling, tried to understand his last moments. But I couldn't. My imagination wasn't big enough to hold that much horror. The battlefield was quiet and peaceful when I visited, just fields and fences and those sunken roads. It looked like any farm in Pennsylvania, but the ground there is full of bones. They found bodies for years afterward, decades afterward, turning up in farmers' fields when they plowed deep. I looked for Marcus's grave, but there was no way to find it. The mass graves from right after the battle, the ones where they buried men hastily before moving on, most of those were unmarked or the markers had rotted away. In 1867, they'd established a national cemetery, and reburied thousands of soldiers in neat rows with proper headstones. But many remained unknown. Thousands of graves just marked, "Unknown U.S. Soldier." Marcus might be one of those. Or he might still be in a field grave, somewhere that was never found. I walked through that cemetery for hours, looking at name after name, hoping stupidly that I'd find him, that somehow the records had been wrong, and he'd gotten a proper burial with a stone bearing his name. But I never found it. He's lost to history, lost even to the place where he fell. I came back to the farm that evening, feeling older than I'd ever felt before. Margaret asked me if it had helped, going there, seeing the battlefield. I told her I didn't know. I still don't know. Maybe it helped to make it real, to stand on the actual ground where my brother died. Maybe it just made the loss feel bigger, more final. All I know is that from that day forward, I could never think about the war the same way. People talk about glory and honor and noble sacrifice, and maybe there's truth in that on some level. The Union was preserved. Slavery was ended. Those are massive achievements, worth fighting for. But the cost, God, the cost. I've tried over the years to find meaning in Marcus's death, to convince myself that he died for something important, something that mattered. And intellectually, I know that's true. The cause was just. Preserving the Union, ending slavery, those were righteous goals. But in my heart, in the place where I still miss my brother after 75 years, I can't quite make the equation balance. He was 21 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He should have married Catherine, should have built that house on our property, should have raised children and grown old and died in his bed, surrounded by people who loved him. Instead, he died in the mud in Maryland and got thrown into a trench with dozens of other boys who also should have lived. Where's the meaning in that? Where's the justice? I raised my sons to understand the cost of war, to know that it's not an adventure, not a game. When the Spanish-American War happened in 1898, my oldest Marcus was only 15, and he got caught up in the fever of it, the excitement. I sat him down and told him about his uncle, about the real Marcus Thornton, who he was named for, about how war takes young men full of promise and gives back broken bodies or gives back nothing at all. I don't think he fully understood then. Young men never do. They think they're immortal, think war is something that happens to other people. But at least I tried. The farm is gone now. I sold it in 1924 when I got too old to work it properly. It's been divided up, parceled out to different families. The house where I grew up, where Marcus grew up, that's still standing last I heard, but it's not ours anymore. Someone else lives there. People who don't know the history, don't know that a boy left from that porch in May of 1861 and never came home. Don't know that his mother cried in that house for 30 years, that his father died there with his son's name on his lips. The land doesn't remember. Only people remember, and we're dying. I have one thing left of Marcus, one physical object that was his. It's a folding knife, a pocket knife with a bone handle. He got it for his 16th birthday, and he carried it everywhere, used it for everything on the farm. But the day he left for the war, he took it out of his pocket and gave it to me. Sighed, "Keep this safe for me, Eli. I'll want it back when I come home." I've carried it in my pocket every day since then. 76 years I've been carrying my brother's knife, waiting for him to come home and ask for it back. The handle is smooth now from being touched, from being held. I take it out sometimes and hold it and think about him, about the boy he was, about the man he never got to become. That's what war really costs. It's not just the men who die, though God knows that's terrible enough. It's all the things that never happen, all the lives that never get lived, all the children never born, all the love never shared, all the potential never realized. Marcus should have had 70 or 80 years. Should have had a wife and children and grandchildren. Should have seen the 20th century, seen automobiles and airplanes, and all the changes that have happened. Instead, he got 21 years, and a grave nobody can find in Maryland. And we got a lifetime of missing him, of wondering what he would have been, of living with the hole where he should have been. I'm 89 years old. I won't live much longer. Another year or two, maybe, if I'm lucky. And when I die, I'll be the last person alive who remembers Marcus Thornton as a real person, who remembers his laugh and his voice and the way he used to mess up my hair. After me, there'll be stories, maybe passed down through the generations if my grandchildren care enough to tell them. But the lived reality of him, the actual memory of his presence in the world, that dies with me. That's the final death, I think. Not when your heart stops beating, but when the last person who remembers you dies, and you become just a name, just a date, just a story people tell. But I'll tell you this. Marcus Thornton lived. He was real. He was my brother and I loved him, and he died trying to do what he thought was right. That matters. That has to matter. Even if his name isn't in the history books, even if there's no grave with his name on it, even if soon there'll be nobody left who remembers him, he was here. He existed. He mattered to the people who loved him, and we carried him with us all our lives. That's not nothing. That's not meaningless. It's just quiet. It's just small. Like most of history really is, I suppose. Not the big battles and the famous generals, but the individual lives, the ordinary people who did extraordinary things and then disappeared back into obscurity, leaving only the echoes of their absence behind. I'm telling you this now because somebody should know. Somebody should remember. Even if it's just you listening to an old man ramble about things that happened 3/4 of a century ago. Marcus Thornton deserves to be remembered. They all do. All the boys who went off to war and never came home. All the families who waited and grieved. All the lives interrupted. All the potential lost. Remember them? That's all I'm asking. Just remember.